I've been asked to come over and talk a little bit about agroforestry and what that might be able to offer in terms of water management, land management, etc. Just by way of introduction, way too many sort of logos at the bottom, but I'm a farmer, first and foremost, from Cambridgeshire. I guess I'm an imposter in terms of a farmer to start with, because I'm a first generation farmer, and I originally started life as a soil scientist, and that led me into agroforestry because of some challenges we had on the farm at home. But with another hat, one or two hats on, I was fortunate to do a Nuffield farming scholarship on agroforestry some 15 years ago, looking at it globally. I've been a farm business consultant for 25 years. And I'm a non-exec director at AHDB, Agriculture and Horticulture Development Board, and do some work with Innovation for Agriculture and the Forest Canopy Foundation. So juggling too many plates, I guess it's the curse of having an inquisitive mind. So what I'm going to try and cover off over the next sort of 40 minutes is really thinking about some of the catchment challenges, some of the ability of our landscapes and soils. What the hell is this agroforestry thing? How can we apply it to sort of natural flood management principles that Chris has outlined already? Give you some examples of where it's worked, and talk a little bit about what some of the blockers have been or are for managers, land managers and farmers, what some of the drivers are, and what some of the sort of policy things that are happening at the moment that will help enable that. So we all know we've got some big challenges as land managers, or whatever, whether we're farmers, whether we're foresters, whether we're conservationists. Climate change is, you've only got to stick your head out the window and know that we get excessive events of either too much of the wet stuff or too little, depending on where we are. And if we look at some of the climate sort of models and predictions, and at least what happened last year, we know that we are getting wetter winters and we're getting very dry summers. I think it was only 2021 they said that it was a 1 in 100 year chance that we'd hit 40 degrees in the UK, and lo and behold, last year we had a couple of good days of it, and that's creating a bit of a challenge. So the predictions are that we're going to get hotter, drier summers, but when it does rain, there's much more intensity and more peak flows in drains and rivers, and we're going to get wetter, milder winters. And so we've got to think about dealing with those in the coming years. If we look at some rainfall, quite surprising really, because we all think about the British April showers, wet, damp springs, but actually the data doesn't support that anymore. The data rather shows that actually we're getting high rainfall events in the summer, and often when land is unable to absorb, with dry land, when that land is unable to absorb those high rainfall events, and we're seeing more rainfall in the summer, higher intensity, and wetter winters. So our springs are increasingly quite dry, and our autumns are increasingly quite dry. So the climate is changing in terms of what we're seeing, and that's certainly having an impact, as we've already heard about how our landscapes deal with those peak events of rainfall, and how we have to manage that in land. And there are lots of issues as land managers and as farmers we need to think about, associated with as you already heard, flooding, the impacts on biodiversity, runoff into watercourses, and along roads, and impacting on infrastructure, let alone some of the pollution and nutrient flows, pesticides, etc. that can go with that. Just to sort of focus our mind a little bit, before I get on to agroforestry, more. This is an image from the Landsat satellite, and you'll see over here coming out of the River Severn, which obviously the Wye's feeding down into. You can see quite a big plume of sediment out of that estuary. You can also see the same out of the Thames estuary here, probably out of the Humber as well, and probably out of Southampton. That sediment that's leaving our land, that's taking with it not our worst soils, but our best soils. And it's taking a lot of nutrient and pollution with it. So, you know, to focus our mind, we need to stop that happening, and we need to keep our best soils where we want them, and we need to keep the nutrients that we're investing in as land managers and farmers where we want them, rather than creating offshore problems. Because we're slowly just exporting quite a lot of that to the rest of Europe. It's a sort of reverse Brexit, I guess. And in many ways, you know, we don't get worried about drought so much in this country, or at least haven't done historically, but I think it's going to become more of an issue for us. If I talk to farming colleagues in other parts of the world, in Australia or in Africa, or even in Southern Europe, water is a much bigger issue for them in terms of having either, you know, not enough or maybe too much. And those famous words of Eric Morecambe that said, "I'm playing all the right tunes, but not necessarily in the right order." Water's about the same, really. We've either got too much of it, we've got lots of water, but not necessarily in the right place. We've either got too much of it or too little. And so it's about water management. We tend to be very good at evacuating water in this country out to sea, but not so good at managing it and keeping it where it needs to be. And front and centre there, really, Chris sort of mentioned it earlier on about farmland. You know, our principal method of managing water must be to keep it where it falls, and improving the capacity of farmland to actually absorb that water and slow the flow right at the start of that journey. So if we can get our soils to actually absorb and hold that moisture, they can become more resilient to drought, and they become more resistant to losing that water and creating downstream problems. And a 1% increase in organic matter in soils means 170,000 litres of water per hectare increased capacity to buffer that at source. So that must be front and centre in terms of how we think about managing and incentivise in terms of natural flood management. And there's lots of evidence around what increasing soil organic matter can do in terms of both physical, chemical and biological improvements in soil. I make no apologies for focusing on this, because as I say, I started life as a soil scientist, so it's always driven my thinking. But in terms of water, you know, better infiltration, better aggregate stability or soil cohesion, improved water holding capacity, and reducing that sort of soil surface damage, absolutely fundamental by increasing soil organic matter. The problem is, at the moment, you know, if you pick up the two main agricultural or land management handbooks for economics and costings, they're at the top here. If you page through the index or even through the chapters, you won't find soil in there. So the resource, you barely find water in there other than what it's charged for abstraction or for use. But the main two economics things that we base our business models on don't include our most fundamental resource, and that has to change. So there's lots of work been done by the DEFRA, Natural England, Centre of Ecology and Hydrology, that, you know, lots of research, well understood. Increasing soil organic matter increases water holding capacity, it reduces bulk density in soil and aids with that infiltration. But fundamentally, you know, if you look at, this is data from where, the 1940s, 1930s, right through to the 2020s, the amount of carbon or organic matter in our soils post-war really has depleted. You know, we've been very good at taking carbon and organic matter out of our soils, so reducing that water holding capacity, but actually we've been not so good at putting it back in. You know, is agriculture still emptying the soil carbon or soil organic matter account? What impact does that have on infiltration, flooding, drought and water? Yes, yet it is still doing that, because the incentives are around increasing productivity, and we're only now starting to enter an era about resource protection and resource capacity, and rewarding those land managers for actually thinking about how we actually build that capacity back, having really incentivised them with policies and finance to remove that capacity for the last 70 years as a consequence of wanting more productivity and output. So there are lots of things we can do, and I'm sure Niels will talk more about these later on, so I'm not going to dwell. There are lots of things that we can think about improving that capacity of our soils in terms of management approaches, and I'm just going to talk really about the sort of agroforestry element of that menu of choices, because that's what I've been asked to do. So agroforestry is an interesting one, and as a definition, it's a land use where trees are combined with crops and or livestock on the same area of land, and where there's always a significant ecological or economic interaction between the tree and the agricultural components. So it's not forestry and it's not agriculture, it's a sort of hybrid between the two, trying to get the best out of the trees and the best out of the sort of cropping or livestock components. And those ecological or economic interactions can be positive, but they can also be negative. But what we're trying to do is get the best out of both elements, rather than have too many things like competition. It's certainly not a new concept. This picture close to me here, this is a picture from a biplane from the last century of northern France in the Bocage near Normandy, which bogged down the landing troops in the Second World War when they did the Normandy invasions. And the landscapes even today look very different than they did then as a result of the common agricultural policies basically saying anything with more than 50 trees per hectare on a parcel of land ceases to be agriculture, it becomes a forestry. So farmers, rightly so, took hedges and trees out of the landscape to be eligible for some of those grants and subsidies through the common agricultural policy. But we find ourselves in a different place today. So agroforestry can take many different forms. Typically it's either characterised as either silvo arable, crops and trees. So this might be grain production with timber production, it might be with fruit or nuts, it might be for biomass, or it's characterised as silvopastoral, where you've got trees and livestock interacting together, and examples of that might be either planting trees or orchards with having sheep or cattle or ruminants or pigs or poultry. But equally it can be the other way around. It can be actually saying, well, actually we can manage woodlands better by actually having a grazing element within the woodland capacity, because instead of having bare ground under those trees, if we lower the density of those trees slightly and allow vegetation to grow in the base of those trees, that can actually manage water quite effectively as well by having that vegetation growing. So you can come at it from either end. The challenge is whether we are a farmer or a forester, or where we work for an agency or a conservationist, we all have different goals, necessarily objectives, interests. We use different languages and we use different metrics of success, of measurement. And we need to come together very much in terms of thinking about how we manage those landscapes to achieve the desired goals that we're seeking. As a farmer myself, actually one of the drivers for the way I started thinking about agroforestry is a recognition that actually my job is really simple. I harvest sunlight, I mix it with a bit of carbon dioxide and water, and I grow stuff, or I rear stuff. It's no more simple than that. But as a conservationist, or as a catchment manager, or whatever your occupation is, we're actually all doing pretty much the same thing. We're harvesting resources and we're using those resources to do something that we want them to do in terms of outcome. But as a farmer, I recognise that actually at a time of the year when I'm growing a cereal crop, for example, a time of the year when there's near maximum solar radiation as a primary input to my business, I've turned the solar panels off, because I've got crops which have gone golden brown and they're not harvesting sunlight, they're just senescing and dying ready for harvest. So how can I have something that's always growing Because if there's something that's growing and covering the landscape, that's doing a job. It's doing a job in terms of feeding soil, but it's also doing a job in terms of protecting the landscape, slowing water flows, providing energy to the organisms which create those structures in the soils themselves. I'm sure Niels will talk more about that later on. Nature's not stupid. Nature's worked this out a long time ago. It's only us as humans that are idiots that have tried to mess up that whole natural process. And nature doesn't do monoculture. Nature does things in different areas of space, above and below ground, but also in different temporal periods over different parts of the year or the season. So there's always something covering the ground, harvesting those resources of sunlight, nutrients and water, and equally doing things below ground and creating those structures below ground to anchor those soils together, to modify infiltration of water, to modify soil structure, etc. So we need to think about how we can mimic nature in a manageable way in our landscapes. And in riparian areas, whether that's in the lowlands, whether it's in the uplands areas, or whether it's in riparian areas, we need to think about how we can integrate both annuals and perennials in different forms to actually do that role for us. Because what we're trying to achieve is to, as Chris has already said, is to reduce some of that surface flow, increase infiltration by slowing the flow or making the funnel bigger or the capacity bigger of our soils and our ability to manage that water through the landscape. And using agroforestry is just thinking about how we can do this at a catchment scale to actually slow flows of water across the landscape, especially on slopes, to actually aid with that infiltration. And that's either doing that by slowing it physically on the surface or by increasing the capacity of our soils by having those deeper rooting structures to actually aid as root stem flow of getting water into the ground and infiltrating better. So it's partly above ground, partly below ground, but by having trees in the landscape, or trees or shrubs or perennials in the landscape as part of the farming or land use system to actually aid with that water management. The other thing we need to recognise is that, hence the Landsat image, is that when we lose water out of our systems or we lose sediment, we're losing nutrients with it. Agriculture is pretty leaky. Nitrogen use efficiency average in the UK is 48%. It's a great business model if you're selling fertiliser. It's not so good if you're managing ecosystems or you're managing a farm business. So Chris says he meets in the pub. I think next time you go to the pub with the catchment officers, buy a pint, pour half of it down your front, and that's where we're starting from. Yeah, 48%. The school report probably says could do better. Some work done by the French on looking at agroforestry in terms of nitrogen capture and utilisation. In forestry, very little nitrogen used because of the type of land use system it is. In agriculture, here we've got a represented sort of 35, 40 kilograms of N per hectare per year. You can pretty much halve that with agroforestry, given that what the crops don't capture, those deeper perennials get a second bite of the lunch at. They don't necessarily. There's not necessarily more for your annual cropping or your grass production, but there is certainly more biomass production on the unit of land, because the trees can actually get a second bite and at least stop it leaving the farm. So that's going to help downstream in terms of pollution, in terms of nutrification. Certainly, if there's anybody here from any of the water utility companies, they spend an awful lot of money trying to strip nitrates out of drinking water. Because actually it's been put there in the first place. If we can stop it leaving the farm, we can actually have a big impact on that. And ultimately what we're trying to do is think about how we can use trees in the landscape, trees and or shrubs, perennials in the landscape, to help manage these peak flow events. Because what we want to do is make sure, as Chris said, that these are kept in the upper catchments rather than in the places that we don't want that water, under the bus stop or the cinema in Stroud or in the front aisle of the multiplex. Just to give you an example, so this is an agroforestry system down in France with some friends that have been doing agroforestry there for a long time, and the river there actually floods on a fairly regular basis, and the agroforestry system does provide a mechanism to at least catch some of that debris that flows downstream, and actually acts as a natural flood management filter. So it's providing a role in terms of flow management, but importantly, later in the season, they're able to get back on that land much quicker than they would in open fields, because the tree roots, those deeper rooting tree roots, are able to infiltrate and absorb that moisture in a much quicker way than they would do on just an open landscape. So it's having a dual role in terms of managing flow, but also actually providing a recovery mechanism for the land as well. So we need to think of whatever we do, very much not as a farm island, but as on a catchment scale. And there are lots of agencies and organisations that can assist land managers, farmers, etc., about thinking about things and joining the dots together in terms of actually thinking about things on a catchment basis. And quite a lot of the work around natural flood management that I've been privy to, and there's clearly some great work going on in the Stroud area, tends to focus on specific things, as Chris has already alluded to, but we need to think about joining those things up at a catchment level and getting land managers and farmers to work together. So rather than looking at just in-field actions and riparian actions, it's actually thinking about things on a catchment scale. So it's unusual that a farm will cover an upper catchment and a lower catchment. They tend to be in specific areas, but actually getting those landowners, land managers to actually work together is actually really important to get that sort of catchment management approach. And I think one of the problems one of the potential opportunities is through the countryside stewardship scheme is actually facilitating farmers actually working together in those groups, because to date that has been missing. Farms and land areas have been very much looked at as individual islands, and the only way we solve these problems is actually by actually thinking about working at a catchment scale. Whether we're at the end of the watercourses nearer the sea, or whether we're up in the upper catchments, there are many things that we can do in terms of riparian management with perennials and using agroforestry approaches. And one of the key things that got me interested in it originally was that this idea that actually having something growing with the ability to absorb water throughout the entire season is really important. Having that temporal coverage of growing plant and different spatial coverage above and below ground is the way that nature would do it, and that's the way we need to harness those approaches. And if you just look at an example here, so this is the growth chart and the nutrient, water, sunlight usage of an annual wheat crop here. So from over the winter, early part of the spring, by midsummer, it's dying, it's not doing anything, it's not harvesting photosynthesis, it's not using any water, etc., etc. Whereas trees tend to start much later in the season, and they grow they lose their leaf much later in the season in the autumn. So there's a temporal overlap. The second thing is that actually they actually do things in a completely different area of space above and below ground. So they're not necessarily competing. And this was some work done looking at tree root morphology under different growing situations. In this case, for about a 20-year-old poplar tree. And on the left-hand side, you can see that poplar tree growing under a forest or a plantation situation, and on the right under an agroforestry situation. with a completely different root structure. Same tree, same location, literally within about 10 metres of each other. Same age, same variety, same management. Well, apart from a different system. And the reason for that is that in a forest situation, the tree roots will always put their smaller roots nearer the surface, because that's where all the water, nutrients and food are. So that's where they put their rooting systems. In an agroforestry situation, when you've got either an arable crop or a grass crop or an annual crop mixed with some land cultivation, you tend to find that you effectively root prune. So you're actually managing the way those roots are physically, but secondly, that annual crop will wake up and use those nutrients and water and sunlight earlier in the season. So when the tree wakes up later in the season, there's less for it to actually go and utilise. So it has to put its roots down deeper. So you end up with this completely different root morphology. That then has an impact on the ability to stem flow water at depth greater, and also in terms of anchorage and the ability to withstand things like storms, wind, etc. So it has a material impact on how those trees behave and how the resources flow around them. But farmers land managers will say, well, this is all very well, but I make money from grass, I make money from wheat. How do I make money from trees? Why would I plant trees on land and be less productive? That's what many say to me. So how do we compare productivity? And when I mean productivity, I mean total output of biomass that I can sell over a cycle. If we compare a hectare of agroforestry where the trees and the crops are grown together compared to where they're grown separately, we would need 0.6 hectares of trees grown separately and 0.8 hectares of crop being grown separately. And we can use the concept of a land equivalent ratio. So if you've got 1 and 1, that's the same. If you've got 2 and 1, that's equal, or 2 to 1, it's either twice as good or twice as bad. The research has shown that agroforestry can have land equivalent ratios of about 1.4. That means 100 hectares of combined element of agroforestry can produce as much as 140 hectares of farmland where the trees and crops are grown separately. That's potentially up to 40% more productive. And you think, well, hang on a minute, how is that possible? Well, that's probably at the far end, or the top end. A big pan-European study looking at 42 different tree combinations found LERs between 1.1 and 1.4, but the majority around 1.2, 1.3. That's still 20 to 30% more productive. And it's able to do that because you're keeping the solar panels and the nutrient capture turned on for longer, because you haven't got these periods where you switch things off. And secondly, you've made the landscape bigger in a three-dimensional way. Don't tell my landlord this, because he charges me rent on a per acre basis. As soon as he switches to a per cubic acre basis, I'm in trouble. So we can make the farm bigger and we can use those resources for longer. That's how we can get more productivity out of it. So we're trying to use agroforestry to improve soil and water quality and protection, keeping the soil where it is, keeping the moisture where it is, reducing wind speed. We forget that we're actually in one of the windiest places in Europe. We're right on the edge of the ocean. It's pretty windy here. If you go to the main continental Europe, it's never as windy as it is here. Reducing evapotranspiration in the summer to keep that better water utilisation by crops and grass, but also to improve drainage in the winter where we want that improved drainage, to mitigate some of the impacts of flood, and to actually modify those microclimates in a localised sense. So to give you an example, and I think I've used this example because it relates quite well to this sort of region. There was some work done by a group of farmers in Pontbren in mid Wales, all back, sort of started in 2004, went through to about 2011. And there was a recognition that during the sort of 19th, 20th centuries, quite a lot of the landscape had changed agriculturally and had become quite simplified. Great trees here, grazing here, and that was partly to do with policy, partly to do with mechanisation, etc. And some of those landscapes having some real challenges in terms of overland flow, compaction, some issues around sort of shelter and managing livestock. So they worked with some organisations, including CEH, Woodland Trust, etc., looking at some intensive monitoring over a period of time, and as a result of that, they increased woodland agroforestry planting from 1.5 to 5% of the land area. So relatively modest, quite a small increase, but it had quite big impacts. What they were finding is that where the shelter belts were actually planted, they were getting up to 60 times the rate of infiltration than they were from open landscapes. So those regular use of sort of shelter belts under agroforestry systems were actually aiding with that infiltration of water quite significantly. Where they were excluding livestock from streams, small streams in the upper catchments, that was allowed vegetation to recover, reduce bank erosion, increase stream morphology and the sort of riffle effect. And on a wider catchment basis, they were reducing stream flows by 40% and put an economic cost to that, obviously to the Welsh Government, and seen really as a cost-effective way of reducing sort of risk in that catchment. And at a sort of larger landscape sort of scale, there are a range of benefits in terms of habitat, carbon storage, etc., water quality, flood risk management that were flowing from that sort of change in management and that implementation of agroforestry. To give you another example, one or two of you may have heard of a small company called Nestle, who have a small bottled water product called Vitel. Well, Vitel is actually a little village in eastern France, and they are, as a company, they want to maintain the quality of that product. So I've actually invested in about 40,000 hectares of agroforestry around that catchment to manage water and maintain water quality for all those reasons we've just said about nitrate management, pollution, etc. So they've invested in that catchment a significant amount of planting of trees, both in pasture landscapes and arable landscapes, to reduce that impact on groundwater in particular in that case, because they're pumping it and putting it into bottles and charging stupid amounts of money for something that we can turn the tap on and get for free, which always I think is amazing. So there's some practical examples there, and Google that and have a look at it. There's some quite good information. On my own farm, so this is my own farm over in Cambridgeshire. Obviously a very different landscape to here. We're a fairly flat landscape. We're actually at or below sea level. And you might think, well, water's not an issue. But water's just a bigger issue for me as it is for you. Because every field I have has water around it, and I've either got too much of it or not enough. There's either too much and I've got lakes, or there's too little and we've got drought in a drier part of the country. So managing water is equally as important for me. And we've put in, we're over here, we've put in 52 hectares of agroforestry back in 2009, actually combining a fruit crop with understories of pollen nectar species and integrating that into a countryside stewardship scheme. And actually I've got a sort of double bubble approach, wheat and fruit. Wheat and apples all in one field. All I need is a splash of milk, and I've got apple pie all in one field. So what's not to like? And that's really worked for us in terms of delivering on biodiversity, increases, delivering on soil and water quality management and protection, and actually being more productive and profitable. So where are we? Where is our land use at the moment? Well, our land use is actually, we're one of the countries with the lowest level of tree cover in Europe, albeit you've got 27% tree cover in this catchment, Nationally, we're at about 13%. We're about, as you can see here, 31% grass and 26% cropland, etc., etc. If you look at some of the work that's been done by the Climate Change Committee, you know, they have some fairly punchy recommendations to government, increasing agroforestry area. 2% of the landscape should be covered by agroforestry is their recommendation, moving from 13 to 17% woodland. Some of that's around the climate change agenda, around carbon sequestration, and meeting our climate change obligations, etc. And actually a slight change in, you know, slightly changing grassland and sort of cropland. So it's certainly a political imperative, but equally there are some real barriers. You know, if we're looking at long-term projects and including perennials and trees in landscapes, there's a massive issue around land tenure. 32% of our land, our agricultural land, is tenanted. How on earth are you going to have a tree planted when you've got a tenancy agreement for only 3 years? How does that work? We need some more imaginative approaches to thinking about our land tenancy arrangements. I'm actually a tenant on my farm and I've done it. But it took some imagination, I can tell you, and took some different sort of discussions with landlords. We've had separate forest and agricultural policies for the best part of 80 years, but they're starting to come together. We need to think about an integrated land use policy rather than separate forestry and agricultural policies. And the environmental land management scheme, which I'll touch on in a minute, is contributing towards that. I mean, it shouldn't be hard, should it? I mean, the ruling party at the moment has got a blessed tree in its logo, so it shouldn't be too difficult to think about. But you know, that's liable to change, I guess, is the only way you can describe that. So, as land managers, as farmers, as agriculturalists, we know that, as it says in the bump from DEFRA, that farming is changing. We're going through a transition post Brexit of a change away from direct subsidies to the environmental land management scheme and the principle of public money for public goods, and agroforestry. How does that fit into that? After 10 years of, I suppose, lobbying, talking to government and the Forestry Commission, back in 2020, we actually had agroforestry recognised under the basic farm payment scheme, so farmers could plant trees within agroforestry systems on their land and not be penalised. That land would still be eligible for the basic payment scheme as it exists at the moment, recognising that won't exist by 2027 as it's phased out. We have things like the England Woodland Creation Offer under countryside stewardship to help plant trees and fund tree management. Agroforestry can fit into that. It's not designed for agroforestry because it tends to want higher planting densities, but it can be used. As part of the environmental land management scheme for farmers, there's a suite of new SFI measures that are coming in over successive years. 2023, there are some new ones coming in for nutrient management, integrated pest management, and for hedgerows. And next year there'll be an agroforestry SFI measure coming into place to help farmers think about either managing existing agroforestry or planting new agroforestry. And over the last 3 years, we've had an agroforestry test and trial, basically looking at these different systems of silvo-arable, horticulture, silvo-poultry, silvo-pasture, upland and lowland, and so woodland grazing, based around 6 monitor farms, which I've been involved with. And we've been really engaging with farmers and land managers, thinking about what advice and payments they would need to implement agroforestry systems. So looking really at testing what those mechanisms of support and advice are, what the barriers and incentives would be to uptake, and working with those that are already doing it and those that are thinking about doing it, and also those that have looked at it and thought, "Phew, it's not for me." Well, we wanted to understand why it isn't for them, and what would make people walk away. So we've had these sort of 6 monitor farms and a range of sort of webinars and workshops over the last few years. In fact, on the 21st of March, which I think is that next week? It is next week. We've got an AM webinar and a PM webinar in the evening for anybody that's interested in this and wants to sort of engage with it. So where's that got to? And I should stress this is in draft form. This hasn't been released by DEFRA. I've been working with DEFRA on developing the agroforestry SFI, and it will look something like this. So this isn't final, but it will look something like this, in that for either a silvopastoral system or a silvo-arable system, there'll be a level of payments for farmers to establish and manage agroforestry based really on a density of planting, on a stem per hectare basis, either at different levels of ambition, whether you want a low density stand, a medium density, or a higher density stand. There will be money money and a requirement to create a management plan, so a system-based management plan and also a pest risk management plan to check the applicability of the system that's going to be put in place. And there will also be money for training and learning, sort of continual professional development, but also money for handbooks, webinars, peer-to-peer learning, etc. So that will look something like, for a silvo-arable and a silvo-pastoral system, a capital payment for planting and management, possibly up to 8 years. I think that's what's on the table at the moment, recognising this is a longer thing. There will be a revenue payment after the 8 years of establishment. There will be a bonus for planting multiple species rather than single species, and there will be money for training, and there will also be the ability to, importantly, to hand on these agreements to subsequent land occupiers. So the ability to transfer it between occupiers rather than having it sitting with individuals. So that's sort of what's on the table. It's with Treasury at the moment, so that's planning to come in 2024, so sort of watch this space. So some of the blockers, as I've already mentioned, around adopting agroforestry have really been around land tenure and security. The ROC review on tenancy reform looks like that was raised in the budget yesterday, and there are some issues that are going to change around taxation and moving towards longer term tenancies, which I think can help with this. They've been around policy uncertainty. Many land managers and farmers have said, well, I want to do something, but I'm not going to do anything until I can see the writing, the writing on policy. So it's a bit hurry up and wait. And there's some real issues around tree health. We're seeing diseases with climate change that we haven't seen before, and we need to be cautious about what we plant and where we plant. And there's a real massive issue around planting material. If we want to move from 13% to 17% tree cover in the UK, where on earth are we going to get all the planting material? Because certainly the nurseries are struggling today, let alone tomorrow. So there's an opportunity there, perhaps as an agroforestry system, to become a nursery producer. Maybe plant twice as many as you need and sell half of them in a few years' time as an income stream. But there are also drivers. So what are some of the drivers? Well, certainly there is really good data from UK and elsewhere around Europe and globally around animal welfare, improvements in animal welfare and shelter and shade with extreme weather conditions, around biodiversity, etc., and what flows from that. Some really good data around sort of agroforestry providing more bird biodiversity, plants, fungi, insects, etc., from having these regular edge effects of refuges and shelter, more food sources, better changes in microclimate. Lots of published data in scientific journals, and whether that's I mean, on our own farm, we've seen a 200% more solitary bees and hoverflies, 240% more bumblebees, and a 10 times higher species richness score. We're looking at sort of agroforestry versus a sort of normal arable system. We see an increase in the biodiversity and the pollinators from having that in place. So there's quite good scientific data around showing the benefits from biodiversity. There's also, I suppose, we've got pretty good economic data and productivity data for forestry and pretty good economic data for agriculture. But actually there isn't so much on agroforestry in terms of economic data, and that's one of the drivers that farmers need to see. How am I going to make money out of this? I was one of the co-authors of the agroforestry handbook in 2019, and there is some economic data in there, but it's limited because there's only a limited number of systems here in the UK at the moment. But as we gather pace with that economic data will build. So why some of the resistance to adoption? Some of that's around policy, short-term policy of government versus long-term thinking and land management. As already mentioned, some of it is around land tenure. We need to be thinking about how we approach the land tenure issues. Some of it will be around skills and knowledge on agroforestry and not knowing about sort of long-term markets. And also about vested interests against change. There's lots of people that have business models around the current paradigm of land management, forestry, agriculture, etc., that don't want to see change because that would interrupt their business models for selling X or selling Y. So we need to sort of recognise all of those and think about how we address them. Some of the economic models might be that actually, as a farmer, you need to think about what are you going to do if you're going to plant trees in the landscape or shrubs in the landscape? Is it for timber? You know, does that work for you in terms of timescales, economics, and tenure? Perhaps it might be fruit production or nut production. Perhaps it might be for biomass on a local basis or on a national basis, or it might be around recreation and amenity that there's some income streams there, or increasingly farmers looking towards things like carbon markets. Some work done by the FAO and the World Bank looking at different land uses certainly showed between sort of crop management, forest management, grazing management, agroforestry had quite a lot of potential in terms of carbon sequestration because the trees tend to grow a bit quicker than they do in a forestry situation. You don't have the intra-competition, but lots of side light, they grow a bit quicker. And some of the work done shown, depending on whether they're slow-growing species or fast-growing species, there's somewhere around 1.5 to 4 tonnes of carbon equivalents per hectare per year. We know at home we're doing about 2.5 tonnes per carbon per hectare per year from our agroforestry with 80 trees per hectare across the landscape. Carbon's worth current about $35, so that's about it's best part of 90, 100 quid a hectare just in terms of carbon equivalent income, which can help with the business model. Currently I'm not being paid for that, but I'm always hopeful. Some work I did with the Forestry Commission and the Woodland Trust was looking at this sort of increase of 13% to 17% of tree cover under the Climate Change Committee. We're a long way off that. I mean, like a million miles, light years away from that sort of change. Recognising that 72% of our land area is farmland in the UK. So if we're going to want to plant more trees, we're going to have to do it on agriculture. What does that mean? Well, can we integrate the two systems together under agroforestry? The work I did with the Forestry Commission and Woodland Trust suggested that if we had 5.8% of land under tree canopy, that would completely meet our climate change obligations under the Paris Accord. It's a relatively modest increase. At home, we've got 8% increase under tree cover using agroforestry, so we're nearly double that, and we've still got an economic model to make the farmland system work. There is public money and there is private money around for tree planting or for agroforestry. Obviously, if it's higher densities under sort of forestry grant schemes or EWCO, there is money through countryside stewardship, and there will be through at some level through the sustainable farming incentive. There is private money through the Woodland Trust and also the Forest Canopy Foundation. Forest Canopy Foundation have partnered with quite a lot of corporates. They'll take some of the biodiversity or carbon money. They'll put agroforestry systems in place. They've currently got more money than projects. So if that's something that you've got interest in, they're looking for people to partner with. Go on the Forest Canopy Foundation website. But there are also new economic models. Water utility companies massively interested in the idea of natural flood management, about agroforestry and other methods of land management. There is money through some of their systems. Some of the NGOs, wildlife trusts, etc., the potential money. There was a question earlier on about biodiversity net gain. It will be an obligation as of the autumn this year that all development of any sort has to have a biodiversity net gain offset in law from this autumn, and that has to have a 10% uplift. And those developers won't be putting those gains in their built environment. They'll be wanting to partner with landowners or land managers to create those gains, and there's going to be opportunities there. 15 years ago, I was knocking on doors of big corporates saying, I've got this great idea to plant loads of agroforestry. Do you want to fund it? I had lots of doors slammed in my face. I think if I was having that conversation today, it'd be an entirely different conversation. So there's going to be opportunities through BNG and through corporate social responsibility and sort of private carbon and biodiversity agreements. So just to finish up then, some concluding thoughts. It doesn't have to be the whole farm or the whole landscape. It can be one field, it can be two fields. Farmers could easily plant on just 20% of their landscape, and remember that 5.8% of the land under a tree or a perennial cover would meet our emissions targets for climate change. So it's relatively modest. Agroforestry has huge potential really for improved catchment management while still producing outputs and income for landowners. When you put agroforestry in, that land is still agricultural. It doesn't change status to forestry. So it's still eligible for all the countryside stewardship and everything else that goes with it, which means you haven't got a permanent land use change, and that's a massive blocker for many landowners. Probably the most dangerous thing, to finish on these sort of useful slides, the most dangerous thing or phrase in our language is we've always done it this way. Perhaps we need to change sometimes the way we look at things. I took this picture, actually it's in Canada, but somebody's mimicked a industrial solar panel with a tree. Well, isn't that what a tree does? It filters water, it harvests sunlight, it builds biomass. Yeah. And whatever we do, we're going to need to be innovative, and we're going to have to adapt to those climate change challenges and think about what we do in perhaps different ways. Okay, I'll stop.
Brilliant. Thanks.